Voting. It seems so basic to the American way of life. And yet in the city of New York, large numbers of people don't do it. The New York Public Interest Group estimates that 1 3/4 million eligible city residents aren't even registered to vote. We'll be talking with New York City Public Advocate Mark Green about what's keeping people away from the polls. But first we have this background report from CSS Urban Agenda correspondent Kathleen Trigg-Jones.
New Yorkers, like a lot of Americans, are failing to vote in droves. Alarmed by the trend, Congress in 1999 passed the National Voter Registration Act, which was designed at least to get more people on the voter rolls. It's sometimes known as the Motor Voter Act because it provided for voter registration at DMV offices, among other public agencies. Nationally, it's been a success, helping to sign up 7 million new voters between 1994 and 1998. But in New York City, it hasn't worked so well. That bothers Councilman A. Gifford Miller.
People's vote do matter. We have to do more of that. We have to do more about thinking about the issues, and politicians need to do a better job of reaching out and making clear that people's vote counts.
So he's co-sponsoring a bill to set up a voter registration at a host of city agencies.
When you go to fill out a form for the city parks to use a playground for a party, you're going to get a voter registration card with it. Whatever the services are that you're working with the city, you're going to get voter registration cards.
Studies at the City University of New York, among other places, confirm that barriers to voter registration is the major factor in keeping actual voting at low levels. Professor Francis Fox Piven has been studying the problem for many years.
And there are two main ways in which the parties keep participation down. One way is making the formal procedures of registering to vote and voting difficult, and especially difficult for low-income people who work full-time and often work 2 jobs or 3 jobs. But the other way that politicians have kept voter participation down is, once you make it harder for low-income people to vote, then you don't make the appeals that would pull them to the polls.
But inconvenience is just one barrier to swelling the election rolls. Another is that elected officials often don't want many new voters. Just ask Angelo Falcone of the Puerto Rican Legal Defense and Educational Fund.
And what happens is if you get involved in some sort of large-scale voter registration drives and mobilization, you're starting to bring in new people. And those new people may not vote the way you want them to vote. And so there's that kind of self-interest of once you're in, you basically don't want things to shake up too much because they may not go in your favor.
Naomi Bernstein, a spokesperson for the Department of Elections, agrees in part, but she says the problem with voting is not registration as much as it is low voter turnout.
We're very successful with our registration drive, but we're not getting the people to get out to vote.
Okay. Why do you think that is?
I don't know. Is it apathy? Is it they feel that, oh, he's going to win anyway, he doesn't need my vote? Is it that the citizens just don't really care anymore?
In the end, voting is about power and deciding who will spend billions of our dollars and make laws for our lives. It remains to be seen whether that power will become easier to access here in New York City, and even if it does, the bigger question is how many people will bother to use it. I'm Kathleen Trigg-Jones reporting for the CSS Urban Agenda.
With more on the voting problems of New York City, we have with us Public Advocate Mark Green. He is first in line to succeed as mayor, should that office become vacant. He also has power to introduce bills into the City Council, and he's done just that in connection with voting. He's co-sponsor of the pro-voter bill that Councilman Miller discussed in the clip. Well, Mark, what's going to happen with the bill, first of all? Does this...
I'm optimistic that it will both pass and be signed by Mayor Giuliani. I mean, it's hard to be for the proposition, let's have fewer voters. But in fact, that's what's happened over the decades, as your experts in your little video showed. That is, there are some people, incumbent parties, conservative parties, who don't want more people voting or more minority, low-income people voting because they could vote against them. And so I with Councilmember Gifford Miller, proposed a pro-voter law a local version modeled on the national law of 1993 that was pioneered by two New Yorkers, Francis Fox Piven, who was in your tape, who happens to be married to Richard Cloward, a professor in New York City, and the two of them had a big idea. At nearly no extra expenditure, why not have agency-based registration? Since the city deals with people when they answer consumer complaints, give out welfare checks, send out water bills, let the government automatically hand out voter registration forms to those who are not registered, and explain to people who may be insecure on how to fill it out, instructions on how to do it. Registration will go up, and then one hopes voting will go up.
How is the mayor reacting to this particular proposal?
He was initially reluctant, and he said, "Oh, this is too bothersome, it's too expensive." And I had said, what was, I think, a political analysis, I'll confess, that he doesn't want more people registered where he's unpopular. He's running for the U.S. Senate, presumably, and New York City voters and polls favor his opponent. I couldn't care less. I want more people registered throughout the whole state. And after sitting down with the two sides, the mayor agreed to approve and sign a version of our bill that we think is strong enough. So I'm optimistic. Despite his initial reluctance, he'll do it.
One of the issues, and we've been major supporters of Motor Voter. Actually, we do some of the regional legal work on Motor Voter implementation, the Community Service Society. We have done a little surveying, however, informal at best, of people coming out of some of the welfare offices where they're supposed to receive a voter registration form, though not in precisely the form we like it. And by no means scientific, one of the general reactions you had, I've just been beaten up by those bureaucrats in there. I wouldn't give them anything, including my voter registration, even though I want them out of there. How are we going to get over particularly in minority communities and poor communities, the general fear that giving any information is a danger? Because that's clearly one of the issues on registration.
That is a problem. National voter registration has worked best in motor vehicle bureaus. It's computerized, it's standardized. The problem is that in New York State, 90% of upstate potential voters have cars. Only 50% of New York City voters, potential voters, have cars. So more of them register upstate at DMV bureaus than downstate. Second, 80% of white residents have cars. 45% of African American and Latino residents have cars. So it automatically is prejudiced against the city and against minorities. Not to mention the other prejudice. I did a study also 5 years ago. We surveyed 408 people walking in and out of income maintenance centers. All were supposed to be handed the form, and then if they were handed the form, they were supposed to be briefed on how to fill it out. Half never got the form. Of those who got the form, 70% never got an instruction. You can blame City Hall, you can blame the bureaucrat, but in a sense, some of the potential voters, the people who are getting welfare checks, are so weary and are so skeptical that they're in a sense at fault also. All I can say is we have to make sure people know that if you register to vote, it doesn't make you any more or less likely to be called for jury duty. We're constantly asked that question. Second, one person saw a picture of Clinton on the wall and actually said, President Clinton, because it's a national thing, and said, "Oh, does this mean I have to vote for Clinton?" Now, we could laugh at that because, of course, it was in their head, and we just have to figure out a circumstance where the person says, "Listen, I'd like to give you an opportunity to do something that has no relationship to to juries, to getting your check, but if you want to vote from wherever you want, here's a form to help." You just got to be sympathetic and do it. And if it doesn't work 100% of the time, let's not make the perfect the enemy of the good. Voting registration will go up in a city where, as NYPIRG, New York Public Interest Research Group, said, 1.75 million, and you quoted their statistic, 1.75 million are unregistered. That's double the number who will vote in the Democratic primary for mayor in 2001 and pick the next mayor. We have double the universe not voting as who will vote and pick the next mayor.
This gets into an interesting issue. Community Service Society has been, for years, spending enormous amounts of money on issues of voter registration in poor communities. and nonpartisan, obviously, because that's what we do. I'm wondering, after watching, particularly, we've just gone through another decennial census and the kind of effort that was made by the government to try to convince people to go with the census, why we are not doing the same kind of push to try to come up with 100% registration in the society. And I think it has, I mean, voting isn't just for fun. There are some really deep problems in a society where people feel marginalized and like they really don't participate. It's not their society. There are these other guys who are operating it. And you know, I see the strains when I talk to many young people, right, that they don't have the sense of buy-in, and voting is part of that buy-in. And in many democracies, it's not an option. You're registered. It's mandatory. We have one of the lowest voting participation rates of anyone in any country in the developed world. And New York, for apparently a rather modest infusion, I think you've come up with the bill. I wonder if the other part of it is to start making this one of the, not lead priority, but something this city does.
That's a good point. You know, when the mayor said, crime is up and let's focus money and ideas on lowering it, it's like the Apollo moon mission. When you say you're going to the moon by the end of the 60s, maybe you'll get there. And we did. We have not made this a priority. The home of the poet of democracy, Walt Whitman, is not very democratic. New York State votes in the bottom third of all the states in terms of registration and turnout actually to vote. You know, we're the Empire State, the proudest state. We're in the toilet when it comes to voting. And there are two reasons, a process and leadership. In terms of leadership, it's unarguable that Governor Pataki and Mayor Giuliani never talk about this. They are apparently, based on omission, uninterested in having people in New York City register and vote. Now, that's a community that doesn't much vote for them. And I do think it's partisan, and I think that's wrong. And I think the next government absolutely could say, let's focus on getting people registered and voting. But second, in terms of process, you know, I watched Naomi Bernstein pulling the levers on the machine. Yeah. This is like spittoons. We're in an era where we're about to have voice-activated internet. And we have machines where you have to pull levers with registration systems that come from a century ago. We had literacy tests, we had registration laws to stop immigrants and minorities from voting. We've gotten rid of whites-only primaries. We've gotten rid of everything except voting registration laws. I don't want people fraudulently registering and voting. You can vote twice, and that's a crime. But I know in this electronic e-government era, we can absolutely figure out a way so that within the next 2 election cycles, let's do away with registration laws. When you go that day, you just enter your numbers or your fingerprint or whatever.
You're right there.
They can electronically immediately figure out whether you're David Jones or you're voting twice, and then you vote. And if you have same-day registration, that's a big deal, because then in the month run-up before an election, when all the ads hit and all the conversation is about the Senate race or the mayor's race next year, that's when you want people voting. But if they're not registered, they're gone.
You know what triggered this whole thing? I was watching a report that appeared some weeks ago about Cleveland fighting desperately to make sure it didn't fall below 500,000 in terms of total population. And the mayor and the elected officials were scrambling
procreating and everything.
To get 1.75 million new registrants would change the entire country's, inevitably, Republican or Democrat, view of New York City. There's no question the huge political power of something like that would change minds about New York. I mean, it's nice that we're clean and crime is going down. If we could also show 1 million plus new voters, and they would be all over the lot. I think the mayor, if he's thinking that way, and the governor are wrong, that people don't vote, all blacks vote this. It's not the way it really happens. People vote their interests, and it spans the ideological divide.
What would change the power alignment in New York State, because of the National Voter Registration Act, which requires agency-based registration for a few agencies, not city agencies. So our law would affect local agencies imitating the national law which affected DMV and other state agencies. Last year, there were 180,000 or so new registrants. Less than a third were in New York City, in our state, because fewer of us own cars, and there are more minorities, and there are more people on welfare, and they're not targeted. If we registered more and voted more, our power vis-a-vis the state would grow. More candidates would campaign down in New York. Urban economic issues would be higher on the agenda for statewide candidates. And so there's a double whammy. Our city, our minority community is being disadvantaged because they're under-registering, and our city is being discriminated against because we are less populous as a voting percentage than we are as residents.
Well, let's talk about something else. I mean, there is an issue as to the most recent legislative session where, in fact, what you're talking about came to the fore. There were a couple of actions where, in fact, both Democrats and Republicans made compromises that theoretically might not happen in the event that there was a large voting majority here. I mean, we've seen, obviously, the mayor's various decisions not to insist upon the TANF surplus, for instance, being used to help people find new work, rather than both the governor and the mayor are talking about tax relief. Do you think these kinds of things could be shifted?
Absolutely. You know, temporary assistance to needy families, TANF, other states have spent a sudden surplus of funds because we're given the same amount of money from Washington for welfare, but the welfare rolls have fallen. What do we do with that bonus? Other states are spending it on better training people from welfare to work, providing quality daycare, so largely women with young kids have the option. The kids are safe and they're being trained for real jobs, not New York State. Why? I've run for office. I don't remember calling the poor person's PAC. Economic interests have political action committees who give money. Rational candidates call people to raise money so they can afford to run and win. And if more low-income people voted, it's inevitable that more candidates would go to the communities who can vote and or even who could give modest amounts of money. They are an ignored population because they are an under-registered and non-voting population. And we now have judgments to make. Do you reduce taxes to certain businesses, or do you spend $100 million more a year to build 2,600 more classrooms so all our children in public schools, not private schools, in public schools are in classes of 20 or fewer rather than 30 or more? That's a political judgment. And I got to tell you, a lot of politicians figure, let's give the tax cuts to our donors up front rather than spending money for classrooms for poor voters in 5 years who won't reward us. If we change registration laws, we can change that political decision.
It's interesting. I think one of the impediments has always been, and I've been in and around political life since I was 9, has always been the question of the Board of Elections and how it's run. What is your attitude? Is this another body that we need to shake up and to bring into the 21st century, or what?
I'd eliminate all local school boards, which are nice on paper,
right,
but are now more costly than adding value. I would declare an educational emergency. Half kids who enter 9th grade don't graduate on time.
Right.
A third drop out altogether. Our test scores have been flat, by and large, for a decade. It's an emergency. We had a crime emergency in 1990 with 2,000 murders. The city came together. We taxed ourselves a little more to cut crime by half. Good deal. We now have to give a mayor emergency powers to pick a chancellor and a board, like Chicago has done. The mayor is responsible for public safety. He or she should be responsible for public education. After a 5-year emergency, let's go back where other officials would suggest experts that a mayor would pick from to be on a board of education, like a mayor now picks judges off a pre-certified list of experts.
Right.
So I would totally flatten the bureaucracy, make schools make the decision with principals, teachers, and parents how to spend the budget they're allocated.
Would you have a school board election? Would you have that kind of? But you wouldn't.
It's fictitious. School board elections now have 6–7% turnout. And if 93% don't turn out, they're voting that they don't care.
Right.
Now, you could make the same argument about elections for Senate or House.
There's been a discussion for a long time of bringing the school board elections right as part of the general election calendar, bringing them right into the booth.
If we're going to continue to have local school boards, which I think have not been worth the cost, then at least you should attach it to a high general election event like November 7th of this year when we're voting for president and senate, the turnout presumably will be as high as it ever gets. I'd like to shrink the school bureaucracy. It's just, no one would invent a system, David, where 6 politicians, the mayor and 5 borough presidents, appoint 7 people who may be John Dewey and Horace Mann, or maybe political pals, not educators, to run the most important function next to policing in our city. Instead, make the mayor accountable, hold him liable for results. Let's have some more charter schools. Let's pay teachers more for more performance, and push the decisions down to the school level, where they report just to a superintendent, and then ultimately to one chancellor who is more a policy director than a bureaucrat.
There's been one argument, obviously, for community school board elections because it's the only election, at least that I know about, that allows non-citizen residents to participate because of their kids' attendance in school. How do they get a role in the system you're suggesting?
That's a nice theory, but again, if 6% entirely turn out, it's a fiction. It's high-minded but poor performance. They play a role. One of the essential ways schools work, and I visited the School of the Future in Gramercy Park, and the Renaissance School in Jackson Heights, and the Franklin Lane School in the Brooklyn-Queens border. They all say the same thing, big or small, new vision or old factory-sized school, parent involvement. You need qualified teachers earning enough and principals who are passionate with the vision, and parents. And so whether they're citizen or not, if when there's a parents' night and they need to raise money for the library, or they need some kind of volunteerism on the weekend, or they need to interact with teachers, parent involvement is critical. And unfortunately, often new arrivals who don't speak the language may be shy or insecure about getting involved, but it's essential. If kids see their parents caring, kids want to rise to the expectation levels created.
Let me, in the clip, the representative of the Board of Elections mentioned the turnout issue. What are we going to do in terms of, once we get everyone registered, assumed our idea, or we move up the numbers, how are we going to go to the electorate, tell them why this is critical? What's going on here? I think political leaders of both parties, and I think Angelo Falcone said it best, don't necessarily have an incentive to get people they don't know to actually vote. What are we going to do here because of the costs and
well, you're right. We've been talking now about the process, and it deters new arrivals from registering and voting. So we want to reduce the burden and the hurdle. Once we've done that, you can lead a horse to water, will they actually vote? That turns on having candidates who, this is what you should be running, David, who are inspirational, handsome, thoughtful. You got to motivate people to actually get out and vote. Now, there's a development that's separate from our discussion which affects it. Term limits. Like them or not, we now have legislative term limits. 36 of 51 council members are out automatically by the end of next year. It doesn't affect Congress members or Assembly or State Senate. It affects City Council. And so I am watching people you've never heard of who can't get 51% of the vote on day one. They're not just minorities, a Bangladeshi, a Peruvian, people who come from niche communities can get enough of their brethren to sign a petition, raise a little money, which is matched by public funds, and they run. And they can win with a plurality, not a majority of the vote. These are people, I think politics in New York will have a revival because of the pressure of term limits. All citywide office holders are out of their current jobs at the end next year. And as I said, 3/4 of the city council. New blood, new people running, new communities being informed, and I hope the conversation grows.
And what do you think, from your vantage point, are going to be the key issues of both this Senate and mayoral campaigns to come? What do you see?
Well, the Senate campaign is unique because you have such famous people who are liked or disliked by different communities as Hillary Clinton and Rudy Giuliani. I mean, I have a preference, an obvious preference as a Democrat, but putting that aside, regrettably, the issues are probably taking second seat. The big ones there are the mayor's 4 vouchers. Hillary Clinton is not if Rudy Giuliani were elected to the Senate, he'd vote to make Trent Lott the leader.
Right.
Hillary Clinton would vote for the Democrat Tom Daschle. So it turns on party. In the mayoral race, I think it's public education and who can racially bring a multiracial, multicultural city together better than the mayor has.
Thank you very much, Mark Green. If there's anything as American apple pie, it's voting. We learn to do it from the time we elect class officers in elementary school. But in the complex world we live in, many, apparently most, adults don't see a cause and effect relationship between going to the polls every year and the quality of their daily lives. The decline in voting is happening across the board in America. These days, if you can get even half the eligible adults to turn out for a presidential election, that's a lot. Every year, it seems, we see electoral contests in which candidates spend more and more money chasing fewer and fewer votes. Although the poor are participants with everyone else in declining voter interest, there are differences. First, voter registration is often harder for the poor. A poor person may have moved several times since the last election, given the dwindling stock of affordable housing. A person may be doubling up with relatives or be homeless. Altogether, it may be difficult and intimidating to prove residency when registering to vote. It's also much more costly for the poor to take time off from work, either to register or to vote. But these obstacles are obstacles that must be overcome. A great many office holders care little about the poor and those of moderate means. That will change only when large numbers of them cast their ballots. It can't be said enough. Voting equals empowerment. This is David R. Jones for the CSS Urban Agenda.
To comment on the Urban Agenda or for more information on CSS, contact Community Service Society of New York, 105 East 22nd Street, New York, New York, 10010. Area code 212-254-8900.